Good afternoon. Welcome to the plenary address for the Royal Irish Academy Conference on the Global Politics of Climate Emergency, being held on April 29th, 2020. We are delighted to have so many join us online, and especially to have Mary Robinson give the address. We would like very much if you would participate, so there is a facility on Microsoft Meets for asking questions, which can be filled in through a box on the side of your screen. This can be filled in the course of her address and during the questions and answers session afterwards. It's fair to say Mary Robinson is uniquely placed to give a perspective on why the climate crisis requires a response based on justice. Her credentials and achievements do not need to be spelt out, but I think some of her current roles are worth underlining. She is Adjunct Professor for Climate Justice in Trinity College and Chair of the Elders. She continues to be a major force in global climate politics, occupying a platform built by her immense contribution through the UN under both climate and human rights headings. Her support of women as climate action leaders in the developing world, and especially in Africa, is unstinting. And all of that is rooted in climate science. Mary serves as patron of the International Science Council, which supports science as a global public good, and it has a key priority to make it accessible for all. COVID-19 has reinforced that essential value in the pursuit of a healthy planet, where the well-being of its citizens is protected. We can only hope the collective action in response to the pandemic can be harnessed now as we emerge from the immediate crisis, that green stimulus is part of all recovery packages, and that any rescue funding is climate proofed. After all, we are entering the critical decade to avoid catastrophe caused by an overheating world and the loss of biodiversity. I know, Mary, you will touch on many of these issues. Over to you.
Thank you, Kevin, and I'm very happy to take part in this conference on the climate crisis of the Royal Irish Academy. I would like just from the beginning to dedicate this lecture to Eavan Boland. She was such a friend and such an inspiration for the whole of my adult life, as she has been an inspiration for so many. The climate crisis requires a response based on justice. I came to the climate issue not as a scientist, but from my work in African countries on human rights and women's rights. When I served for 7 years as President of Ireland, I never spoke about climate change. And even when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights, there was another part of the UN dealing with it. And I think I was in my large silo. But very quickly, in my work in Africa, and I was also honorary president of Oxfam, I became acutely aware that the situation was so different from the experience of Europe or the more industrialized parts of the world. People kept saying to me, things are so much worse. And the worse was the unpredictability of the weather, the climate, whatever we call it. Constance O'Kella from Uganda, who's become a great friend, told me, this is outside our experience. And what she was talking about was the fact that they couldn't know when to sow or when to harvest, and they needed to grow their food. Women had to go further in drought for water, further for firewood. And what really came home to me was the injustice of the fact that these people were not responsible for what I was learning was causing the climate change crisis. The emissions, they didn't drive cars, they didn't have central heating, they didn't have major manufacturing, but they were being disproportionately affected. And over time, I realized that there were about 5 layers, maybe even more, but let me deal with 5 layers of injustice. And the first is the one that I've been referencing, that the poorest countries and the poorest communities and indigenous peoples suffer disproportionately, although they're not responsible for what causes climate change. The second injustice is the gender injustice. It disproportionately affects women and girls in so many different ways. And also women are agents in their communities of trying to build resilience. I wrote a book about climate justice to try and create a certain empathy, and there are 11 stories in it. 9 of them involve women, and there are also 2 good men, but it's all about the gender dimensions, basically. And the third injustice is the one that children have brought home to us in their millions now under the leadership of Greta Thunberg, the intergenerational injustice. They kept saying to us, do something, listen to the science, preserve us, our future, please. We can't do it as children. You must do it. The fourth injustice is one that we don't think about enough, and that is the injustice of the different pathways that countries have had. Industrialized countries have had a pathway of fossil fuel. That's how we built up our economies. And now we're trying to wean ourselves off the fossil fuel and go green, which we must and should. But what about developing countries? They want to develop, they need to bring their people out of deep poverty. And they have found oil and gas and coal. And what are they to do? What they said in the lead up to Paris was, we want to go green, but we need the investment, we need the technology, we need the jobs, and we need the training. And have they got that? Not as much as they need. And the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature herself. The loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species, what we are doing as humans to the ecosystems that sustain us, which is not clever, to say the least of it. So these are the injustices that struck me so forcibly that I now only speak about climate justice, or maybe the climate crisis, climate emergency, as we've spoken about in this conference. But I noted that somehow we didn't seem to care so much when it was over there and not affecting us. It was just difficult to have the sense of empathy. And that was part of the reason why I wrote the book on climate justice. And I have a podcast on Mothers of Invention, which tries to use humor and, again, a feminist approach to this man-made crisis. And I was honored before the Paris Climate Agreement in 2014 to be appointed by then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as his special envoy on climate change. And he said to me at the beginning, he said, do it the climate justice way. So I actually focused quite a lot in my role on the poorest countries, the poorest communities, indigenous peoples, and they were determined to get 1.5 degrees into the text. I remember the mantra in the street in Paris, 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive. And that was successful. The richer countries listened. We had a high ambition group at the end, brought together by Tony de Broom of the Marshall Islands, who had a wonderful personality and determination. And so we got a new goal in Paris, to stay well below 2 degrees and work for 1.5 degrees. And the scientists had never studied this. So the Paris Agreement asked the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to study this and tell the world, what's the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees? And if we have to stay at 1.5 degrees, what do we have to do? And that was what the scientists told us in a major report in October 2018, which is now our new goal. What the scientists said was, yes, there is a big difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, because in that time, very bad things can happen. The coral reefs will probably disappear. The Arctic ice will probably disappear. And the permafrost will melt hugely during that time and throw up not just carbon, but methane, which is even more lethal in its impacts. And so the scientists of the world said the whole world, not just for the small island states out there, the whole world should, if possible, stay at 1.5 degrees. And they were very explicit about what we needed to do. We needed to reduce our global carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. In October 2018, they said you have 12 years, which wasn't quite true. Now we have less than 10 years. And I have to say, quite honestly, that in January of this year, the start of 2020, after a COP in Madrid, which I'd been to, COP25, I felt very down. I was trying to hide this. The elders, which I'm chair of, have to bring hope, but it was hard because I couldn't see how we were going to do this. I couldn't see how we were going to get countries to understand and listen to the scientists and have the ambition to really change things and move much more rapidly. We needed much more ambition than countries were beginning to show. Even the European Union, which was, moving a bit, still wasn't really getting to the level that we needed to see. And I was really kind of saying, what will it take? I would never have wished a COVID-19 on the world for obvious reasons. This is a terrible crisis, a short-term, dangerous, terrible crisis to our world. First of all, to our health systems, to our economic system, to our social system. And it is not an equal crisis, as we know. In a way, the COVID-19 crisis has captured the inequalities and exacerbated them. It has shown us the intersectionality between poverty, gender, inequality, race, being marginalized, being a migrant, being a person with disabilities, being an indigenous person. It's all linked in the degrees of pressure and deprivation that you feel because of COVID-19. It has shown us very clearly that intersectionality, which the feminist movement has long recognized and which we all should think about more. So what are the lessons that we can learn in a more positive way from this terrible crisis that we're still not out of? So we still have the looming climate crisis, but I think we've learned some interesting lessons from the COVID crisis already, although we're still probably at a relatively early stage of that crisis and have to come out of it. And I'll deal with how we come out of both towards the end of my lecture. First of all, we have learned that human behavior matters. It's our compliance with staying at home, being socially distant, being cocooned, as my husband Nick and myself are now because we're of the age to be cocooned, in order to protect the more vulnerable and to protect health workers. There's no other way we can deal with this virus at the moment because we don't have a vaccine. So we're helping to deal with a major crisis, we collectively. That's a little bit empowering. It's something to think about when it comes to the climate issue at a later stage. Science matters. You know, on our television every evening, it's the health experts that are listened to, and we know that the government is basing its policy on those health experts. Why don't we listen to the climate scientists in the same way and base our policy on the climate science, as the children have been begging us to do? The third lesson is that government matters. We can see very cruelly in some respects that bad government, delaying or denying this problem, causes lives. We're seeing it in big countries that should know better. It's very revealing. And it's important that government matters and that health systems matter, because we're going to have to prevent future pandemics. It's also important, and this is something more subtle in a way, but I think it really is important, that compassion matters. What we're seeing all around this country and all around other countries is more neighborliness, more thinking about the older person down the street who's on their own, the postmen who are calling at doors, the way everybody is reaching out to neighbor. It's been brought together in the kind of community approach that is part of government policy now, which is very good. It's the spirit of Mehel in Ireland, but it's also there all over the country, all over the world. And empathy. You see, we're all suffering now. We're not suffering equally, but we're all suffering. So it means that we're more open to the suffering of others. And that is important because it helps us to bond, it helps us to see a global solidarity of the fact that as a human species, we're very vulnerable. We have made mistakes in not living in a compatible way, sustainably with our Earth ecosystems and Mother Nature. And that's causing huge problems and is also at the heart of this epidemic. We've also learned what are the jobs that are essential when you have a crisis. They are the health and the care jobs. They are the very low-paid jobs in services, in collecting waste and bins, in driving trucks to bring supplies in of essential goods that we need. Jobs that are largely underpaid, jobs that are very significantly filled by women at the moment in an underpaid way in our unequal society. And the last one that I would mention is we cannot do this without developing countries. Just as to tackle the climate crisis, we must get the clean energy to developing countries, so we must strengthen the health systems and get the PPE equipment, get the vaccines fairly to developing countries. They are much weaker, but they have large populations. They are the proportion, the majority of the world. If we don't deal with them, then we will have a virus that will return in further surges. So we are that interconnected world. Our challenge now is to build back better. That's the language that the Secretary General of the United Nations has been using. And the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, had a very good op-ed in the New York Times yesterday. He's been speaking very well about climate recently, but also about the COVID-19 crisis. And I just wanted to read out the 6 action points that he has recommended, because I think they are really important. He said, first of all, as we spend huge amounts of money to recover from coronavirus, we must deliver new jobs and businesses through a clean, green transition. Secondly, where taxpayers' money is used to rescue businesses, it needs to be tied to achieving green jobs and sustainable growth. Thirdly, fiscal firepower must drive a shift from the grey to the green economy and make societies and people more resilient. Fourthly, public funds should be used to invest in the future, not the past, and flow to sustainable sectors and projects that help the environment and the climate. Fossil fuel subsidies must end, and polluters must start paying for their pollution. Fifthly, climate risks and opportunities must be incorporated into the financial system, as well as all aspects of public policy making and infrastructure. And sixthly, lastly, we need to work together as an international community. And I think that's a key message which the elders would also support very strongly. We are all in this together. The European Union has a Green New Deal. It has now put forward in this crisis a $1 trillion EU recovery fund, which is a short term. I mean, when I say a short term, it's to get over this crisis, but it needs to be linked to dealing with it in a phased way, getting more and more aware that somehow it's going to be more possible, because all the rules are broken. Governments are doing things they never did before, including, happily, supporting the wages and the social security of workers. And this is really important. So we're going to have new rules when we come out of this crisis. We need to realize, in essence, that the COVID-19 crisis is much too important to waste. It's much too important to waste. It can help us to address the fact that we actually have, even in Ireland, an unequal society. It's been much commented on. It's the subject of much discussion, and we haven't yet got a government that will bring us forward. And I don't want to get political about this, but we need to address the inequality. And we also need to be more sustainable with nature. We have been a laggard on climate change. We are making efforts. I am very encouraged by the efforts that are being made, but we need to go a lot further. And we have an opportunity now to use this crisis to do it. It is not impossible. I'd like to end with the very succinct message from the founder of the Elders, the most wonderful man, Nelson Mandela, who brought the Elders together in 2007. He said at one point, and it's such a beautiful phrase that I will end on and hand back to Kevin for questions. He said, it always seems impossible until it is done. It always seems impossible until it is done. And that's the spirit in which we have to move forward from this severe COVID-19 crisis to the looming climate emergency and come through stronger, better, fairer, more resilient, and more humane.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that. And if it's possible to be positive and uplifting in this terrible crisis, I think you've achieved it, and we're most grateful for that. Just to remind our participants and people tuning in online, you can file questions to Mary on the right-hand panel on your screen, and we're monitoring them there, and we'll hopefully get through all the questions as they're filed. But Mary, just to start the question session, could I ask you, and I hear everything you say about suffering and people becoming more compassionate, and what the UN is saying in terms of Antonio Guterres, but I just fear that, you know, notwithstanding all that, that people in terms of governments will have this dash for growth again, and that'll be the one thing they'll want, and they will take actions that will compound the climate problem and compound the injustice that you have highlighted. So is there any way we can counteract that? And I'm talking really now of the big economies, and you know who I'm referring to there.
Yes, I think it is a real problem. Indeed, let's be very explicit. China was the first country to suffer the COVID problem. It dealt with it in a Chinese way, and it is the first country to be on the road to recovery. It is in a hurry to build up its economy, and unfortunately, it is going the coal route. It is building more new coal power plants than ever before. I hope that it can be persuaded not to go that route, because actually that's not the way we need to go. We need to, China is a lead at the moment on clean energy, on electric vehicles, on artificial intelligence, etc. It has the capacity to give a different sort of lead, and I hope it will, because we cannot deal with this short term in a way that worsens the long-term problem.
Thank you for that. And related to that and to China, I note that pollution is continuing or resuming in China at the moment. But related to that, I want to ask you, we all know what nature has done in the last few months. The world has been given a chance to breathe again. The skies are clear. We feel better walking around our cities when that's possible. So is there anything that we can learn from that? Is there anything of that we can retain as we re-emerge from the COVID crisis?
I think that is a very important point that we're all conscious of. Those who live in very densely populated and very polluted cities are even more aware, and that is the cities in China and in India and in other parts. But even in a Dublin, in a London, etc., we're aware the air is cleaner, the bird sounds are wonderful. There's somehow a sense of springing back. And what is true is that nature does recover very rapidly. Kumi Naidu, who's a very good friend of mine, who's the outgoing head of Amnesty International, before that of Greenpeace. And he had a wonderful phrase that he's used over and over again. What he says is, don't worry about the planet. There's nothing to worry about the planet, the future of the planet. When we have destroyed ourselves, and this is the dark message, the planet will recover very rapidly. And that is something we've seen now, that we have stopped the kind of activities that were causing the emissions, that were causing the pollution, that were causing the air quality to deteriorate, that were causing the health problems, very, very significant health problems from air quality around the world. About 8 million people dying in a year. I mean, we're counting now the COVID deaths. You know, there were more from polluted air, as there were many, many more from climate change that we weren't as concerned about as we need to be.
Okay, thank you for that. And I have a question from one of the conference participants, Claire. It's regarding the fifth injustice that you highlighted, the injustice against nature herself. What is your stance on the late barrister Polly Higgins' proposal to amend the Rome Statute to include ecocide as a crime against peace? The UN Law Commission has refused to accept this proposal. How can we best take this proposal forward? What do you think its concrete impact would be? Well,
thank you, Claire, for the question. I knew Polly quite well. We had lots of discussions about her. proposed ecocide crime issue. I would have been happy to support it, but I kind of felt it was hard to get agreement on something like that. You know, it's a difficult time to get some hard law, especially hard law that would matter to countries, and therefore talking about it was a good thing because it brought home the reality that you know, climate has been causing huge loss of life, the climate emergency that we're seeing, the climate crisis, and it is human-induced. It's not completely caused. Climate would change anyway in its own way, but we're seeing the graphs of the heating, and there is no doubt in any scientist's mind, no doubt in anybody who's open, the only deniers are those for short-term profits, and let's ignore them. So, you know, her argument was a very strong argument in law, if you like, but the reality is it's difficult to get that kind of binding agreement. What we did get, and maybe I can come back, if I may, Kevin, to elaborate on something I meant to speak about. I meant to speak about the legal frameworks that we did get in 2015, because I was witness when I was serving as the special envoy to the negotiations for the 2030 agenda. And Diarmuid O'Donoghue, our ambassador at the time, was one of the co-facilitators of the 2030 agenda. And what was striking to me was that 193 countries could agree an agenda that was full of human rights, gender equality, leave no one behind, 17 sustainable development goals. And the reason I think that they could agree it was that they knew that it wasn't binding, and therefore they could pick and choose. They could decide how much they would do. It was soft law, very soft. And then the Paris Agreement was a bit stronger. But actually, those are the two frameworks we have now. And I think because of the report of the scientists that I mentioned, the report on 1.5 degrees of warming by the IPCC in October 2018, those two frameworks are no longer voluntary. They're made imperative by the science. You know, we have to listen to the science, and therefore we have to implement. And that will be a very good thing, because if we had to reinvent wheels to take us forward, it's much more difficult at the moment because we have populism, we have nationalism, we have, you know, countries that are putting their country first in ways that aren't helpful. And therefore it's harder to get the overall frameworks. But those frameworks are there, agreed by the vast majority of countries and by companies all over the world and civil society that wants to see the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in accordance with the scientific standards of the Paris Climate Agreement as interpreted by the IPCC.
I have a question related to that from one of the participants. Is there any country, in your opinion, that has incorporated climate legislation into justice systems?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. I don't think I can think of one. I mean, I think of Costa Rica sometimes as a country that's done a great deal, but whether they put it in the justice system in that way, I'm not quite sure. One of the other areas that the elders work a lot on is justice. And one of my colleagues, Hina Jalani, is part of the task force on access to justice. That is a major task force in a funny sort of way, and it's an interesting point for me to think more about. I don't think we integrate enough that justice approach and the kind of climate justice that I've been talking about. So maybe I'm encouraged to think a little bit more about that myself, to also integrate into our justice system. For example, I do know that those in prisons at the moment are suffering disproportionately from COVID-19. They're dying and they're suffering hunger and they're suffering, you know, from overcrowding, etc. And a lot of those in prison are not convicted. They're awaiting trial. Anybody now awaiting trial should be released from prison for their own health and safety in any part of the world.
On a separate topic of biodiversity, we have a question from Anthony Brogan in relation to the IPBES global experts having stated that COVID-19 has been caused by rampant deforestation, agricultural expansion, and the illegal wildlife trade. In light of that, do we require a modified Paris Agreement to halt destruction of nature, as well as rising greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I have seen that report of the scientists. I think it's the report that's referred to. I'm not an expert on this, I'm not a scientist, but I do think that, you know, I listened to Jane Goddard talking about this, and she knows a lot about animals, etc. And she has said that we are encroaching on the space of animals in a way, and in so many different ways. But I don't think it's the Paris Agreement that needs to be amended. I think we need to reinforce the biodiversity conference, and that was to happen, as we know, this year. Sorry, Jane Goodall was the person I was talking about, who was a good friend. I gave her an honorary degree in Trinity when I was Chancellor, and I was so thrilled to do it because she's a wonderful woman and a wonderful leader on the climate issue, and especially on animals and biodiversity. But the biodiversity conference has also been postponed to 2021, and I think that's where we have to do far more to address the issues of the link with COVID-19.
Turning more to the national agenda, how can Irish NGOs work together to achieve meaningful collective climate action? Where should our efforts lie so we can act smartly, yet with the urgency required to tackle the crisis?
Yeah, that's getting close to a tricky area for me as a former president. I have to be careful, particularly at this sensitive time when a government is not yet formed and we're waiting for the government programme. But I actually think that NGOs in Ireland have quite a strong voice, and I really want to encourage that voice. And I particularly want to encourage the NGOs that are working with the marginalised in Ireland, with those in the refugees and asylum seekers, with the those who are homeless and you know really need support, and then the NGOs that are working in developing countries. I'm more closely working with them, with Goal, with Concern, with Trócaire, etc. You know, I think they're going to need. We're going to need far more support because their health systems have to cope with this COVID crisis, and their food systems have to cope both with the increasingly urgent impacts of the climate crisis on food, but also the restrictions that are being put in place. So we do need, and always have needed, the NGOs. We need them more than ever. But I want to be careful not to get into any political space on this.
Fair enough. That's understandable, given where we are at the moment. But we have another question from Alison in Paris. How do we harness this energy that we have right now to create a new normal that's fair? You challenge policymakers to listen to climate scientists, but the challenge is really around economic science and social science. How do we find a way forward on moving from fossil fuel-based economies to clean energy economies?
Yes, that's exactly the real question, Alison. I think we need to be brave. We need to know that this crisis mustn't be wasted, that we have not had a good way of dealing with our social interactions. We've had an unequal society. Even, you know, let me be slightly political here. COVID has been good for our health system. We've got a kind of unified temporary health system. What about a unified, you know, sláinte care, permanent health system? What about really investing very strongly in that kind of wind power that's a potential for Ireland? Now I know I'm getting slightly political, but I like the ambition to be brave now. That's what we have to do. We have to spend and be brave to get back in a way that's different, not business as usual. And we're going to have to, you know, realize that if we do, this is where the jobs are. This is where the potential is for people in this country, in Europe, but also in the rest of the world. And we have to understand that we will have a different kind of globalization. When we're seeing this even in food production, and I have spoken a bit about another elder whom I learned so much from. She's now an elder emerita, Eavan. Kevin, I aspire at some stage to become an elder emerita. But anyway, Eavan founded the Self-Employed Women's Association, wonderful association of women in the informal sector. And she's very close. I've been in quite a bit of touch with her at the moment. She's written quite a bit on the COVID impact on the informal sector. That's how I know how devastating and unequal it is. But she says, and has been saying for a long time, why do we eat food grown more than 100 miles away? Now, that's interesting, because what happened with globalization is we got very fast, cheap enough food flown all over the world without taking account of the externalities, the carbon footprint, for example. And I don't think we can continue with this. I think we should have seasons and eat mainly Irish produced food, get good variety, have more variety grown in Ireland. I understand that you can't buy any gardening equipment at the moment, or gardening and plants and things, because everybody's bought them up. That's wonderful. If Ireland is gardening, that means we're beginning to realize we should be growing more and more variety and more diversity at home. And that's all to the good.
Thank you for that. And I think COVID certainly has illustrated the value of local supply chains. And I think we've all learned that lesson. On a separate question from Cormac Nugent, do you think that direct representation in the form of a minister, department or council for future generations, as Wales and a few other states have tried, could provide a solution to address climate justice for future generations?
Well, thank you for that question, Cormac. Actually, that was a priority of my foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice. We came to a planned end because we'd achieved pretty well all our business plan and objectives, except we hadn't quite got the UN to realize that there needed to be a voice for future generations. And then actually that voice emerged with Greta Thunberg and the children. That was almost a sufficient speaking for the intergenerational injustice. But I have learned that it does help. I've been in touch with particularly the Welsh model of having somebody who looks at policies in Wales from the point of view of their impact on future generations. And she's made a difference. You know, it has mattered. And I think it's really worth thinking about as we go forward, that we certainly do need to be planning for future generations in our policies in a way that we weren't up to now.
The next question is from Anthony Coty of UCC, and it touches on the politics, but I think you might be able to answer it in the sense, given we all know that Ireland has become a climate laggard. In that light, what does the next government really need to do to address that, in your view?
I think that's a very tricky one, Anthony, except that I do think that the fact that we've been turned upside down, that the government has had to put in place policies it never imagined it would put in place, must make it braver about realizing we have to reduce carbon emissions by 7% a year, or whatever it is, over the next, to reach the carbon targets. That I think we have to set rigorously. There's no doubt about that. And it will be better for the country. That's the good news. It's just really important to realize that that is where the future is. I was talking to some financial experts recently, and it's companies that put in more sustainable policies that are doing better out of COVID, just because they had already made themselves more sustainable. And I think we have to be smart, and we have to be courageous at the moment, and we have to think in terms of not going back to business as usual, because there was a lot wrong with business as usual. It wasn't sustainable and it was too unequal. And now we have the opportunity, because the cliff is gone. Somehow the undoable has been done. This idea of paying furloughs of wages for so many workers rightly, and protecting people and protecting old people like myself and health workers, we've a different way of looking at things. And I think this means that we have to take the opportunity. Maybe we're very lucky that we're forming a government just at this moment. It wasn't planned that way, but just at this moment, because this new government can have policies that really do look ahead beyond COVID to climate and dealing with both seamlessly. That you deal first and urgently with the COVID problem, with the need to address the economic downturn, etc., but you do it in a way that also addresses the climate crisis looming behind. And then we will have a better, faster, longer-term sustainable future and a fairer sustainable future.
If I could turn now, Mary, to the question of migration, and we have a question from Keisha Jane. In a world where migration has suddenly been brought to a halt, do we, sorry, I'm just checking here now. How do we go forward when we think climate migration and displacement is concerned? How do we prevent reversal on the progress towards protecting the rights of these vulnerable populations?
Oh, I really like this question. Thank you, Keisha Jane, because the elders have been particularly concerned already before this crisis with the closing of borders and opportunities, and the realization, forgetting that migration is part of humankind from the very beginning, largely positive, and what we need to do is manage that issue better, and that we did get a very good human rights landmark with the 1951 Refugee Convention and the right to asylum, and that must be upheld and supported. And there are a lot of problems at the moment for migrants, including migrant workers. Migrant workers in some Middle East countries are sort of locked down in detention areas. That's basically what they are, because they're not able to work and they're not able to go home. And they're in very poor conditions. So as I said, COVID-19 exacerbates all the inequalities and issues. It has exacerbated the problem for refugees and migrants. But we are going to see more migration because of the climate emergency, even if we, as I hope we will, begin to deal with it much more effectively, because we've already built in the problem. We've already built in the problem of the fact that we're at 1.1 degrees now, as determined by the World Meteorological Office. So we're going to see more cyclones at force 5. Take, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa never had cyclones, and yet Mozambique was hit by a cyclone. Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi were hit by a terrible cyclone, which killed a significant number of people, much more than we know, much more than some of the figures for COVID-19, even globally now. It didn't kill probably 3 million, but it would killed a lot of people. It devastated the city of Beira in Mozambique, which is a city of 3 million people. It absolutely destroyed, I think, every house, every building there. So these kinds of issues, the fires in Australia and in California, in first world environments, we're seeing the impacts. That's helpful in at least bringing home that we need to deal with this with more urgency. And I think that's been brought home. I think COVID-19 is helping us with the urgency of realizing that we are vulnerable, that we are in a fragile environment as human beings because we're not treating that environment well. And therefore, the test is how we deal with those most vulnerable. And among those are the asylum seekers and the refugees. And they are being driven by more and more forces, including now the impossibility of living where they were because of climate.
Related to that, Mary, could I go back to the question of COVID in Africa? Like, there is a scenario at the moment that suggests maybe Africa will escape the worst effects of COVID, or is it that really the pandemic hasn't taken hold there yet and inevitably will? How do you view that? And is there a grave risk for Africa in the sense that it will be hit very badly by COVID, and then these extreme weather events, the obvious effects of climate disruption will heap difficulty on top of them?
I think there are some questions that people are asking at the moment. It is true that African countries have very young populations, which is helpful because young people may get COVID, but it won't be as bad. And it doesn't seem to, at the moment, have affected as much I'm aware, because I happen to know the person who's doing it, that Ethiopia is equipping itself very well with an app for the population of Ethiopia to address the issue. So I'm aware of some of the work being done in South Africa. President Ramaphosa has imposed a very strong lockdown, which is very cruel for those who are in very poor spaces, etc. And the police are enforcing, and it's causing some problems. But what he is doing is dealing with the issue in a way that's helping his country. And he's trying to deal with it also, deal with some of the inequality issues at the same time. So there are various things happening, and I'm not an expert in every country in Africa. I'd say the jury is still a little bit out. The problem for African countries as a whole is that they have very weak health systems. They need support in building up their health systems anyway. They need support in having more PPE, more ventilators anyway. And if they are in crisis, they will not be able to cope at the moment, and therefore large numbers may get the virus and it would spread. It hasn't happened in the way that people feared as yet. It's not quite clear whether, I don't think it's possible that African countries will escape entirely just because they have young populations, but it may not affect them quite so badly, but they do need particular support. And when we get a vaccine, it mustn't be a vaccine first for the rich world and then forget about the poorer countries. We have to make sure, I was chair for a number of years of the Gavi Alliance for Vaccination globally, and I'm very aware now that Ngozi, my good friend from Nigeria, who's the current chair, is very worried about access to vaccines and also support for other vaccines, for measles, etc., which are vital for developing countries and for any countries at this time, because there's so much focus on trying to find the vaccine for COVID.
Separate to that, Mary, I would just like to ask you, in terms of coming out of COVID again, is there a risk that countries will dilute their climate obligations and ease environmental regulations in attempt to restore their economics, their economic viability, etc.? And Louise has raised that issue.
Yes, I think Louise, that is a problem. As I mentioned, we already have the example of China. One of the first to, significantly come out of the problem is rushing to build up its economy and going the way of coal, which is actually the wrong route. And I'm sorry that China is doing that, and I hope that it will kind of turn around and realize that it's not the right way. But it is also true that countries may well want to to put the priority on the short term, getting the economy back running, whereas what needs to be balanced is what is the real way to have the sustainable economy running, and that's the real way, and that may mean surprisingly borrowing more and investing more early in order to do that. It's hard to think of that now because we're in the middle of this crisis. People have lost their jobs. I'm more than aware. People are suffering. They're very worried. They're very concerned about how we will sustain the payments to workers, how the government will sustain what it's doing, how we will sustain the health system if we don't get the economy back. But we need to be really, really careful that we remember that we have to have a plan for the sustainable future that avoids us coming up against another worse problem with the climate issue. It's not far away. We have to reduce by 45% our global carbon emissions by 2030. That's less than 10 years away. Between the Paris Climate Agreement and the end of December, emissions went up about more than 4%. So we weren't peaking. Now, if we can make 2019 the peak year for global carbon emissions, which have, it will be the peak year because 2020 will show a drop because of the freezing of economies. Instead of that being a blip that we forget, let's make that a way of saying, okay, we're on the way down and we're going to continue to go on the way down, and we're going to do it in a determined way to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, which the scientists tell us is the only way to have a future for our children and grandchildren. So, we have to plan for a sustainable future, not a quick rush back to immediate bank balance type future.
In the pursuit of that, Mary, in attempting to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, in your view, is there a place for genetically modified crops? Barbara has asked that question.
It's an area that I'm not a particular expert in. I know that when people mention it, that the scientists will tell you there are various kinds of genetically modified, so I'm not sure. I do think, as I say, I prefer the approach of supporting local development, which means less the large modified big crops and more the local crops. But I have seen, science. I've visited places in Africa where they are growing better sweet potatoes, they're growing better rice, they're growing better in order to be more sustainable. I'm all for that. So it's a hard question to answer because I don't think I have the skill set to know the full answer.
Patrick Paul Walsh from UCD has asked us to put this question to you. Do you have any view on the appeal to the Supreme Court of the climate case Ireland?
Oh, Patrick, how could you ask me that? I did hear a little bit of your discussion earlier. No, I obviously am glad that there is an appeal. I think it's important that we use litigation as one of the ways to both clarify and, if necessary, disrupt the wrong way of addressing the climate issue. That's what litigation does. It kind of gives a clarity of legal decisions. So I'm glad that in Ireland, as in so many countries, cases have been taken and that we're getting the clarity of judgments on where we are. It's sometimes helpful. I'm actually more hopeful that the impact of COVID on people generally, that we have rapidly changed our behavior. We, as consumers, need not go back to our bad old ways of a waste society. As I think you know, I've become a pescatarian. I've given up meat. I'm going to give up consuming quite so much in the future because I've seen I don't need to. I had already said that I wasn't going to buy new clothes. I have enough jackets now, and I'm a jackets person, to wear these jackets and vary them around a little bit. And then if you see me in them too often, well, so be it. She'll be in her old jacket. Who cares? I think we need to get back to some of the old habits of mending, of reusing, of sewing, of darning, of sewing buttons on things, and less of the waste. And then we need to get to the circular economy and eliminate waste altogether and find it exciting and innovating. And then also respect the bin workers who are such essential workers in our current COVID economy. We salute them, and there are people now dressing up because that's the only thing they go out for, is to bring the bin. They're doing that in Australia, as you probably saw. And I love to see some of the pictures of the exotic gear they use to put the bin out. But it also teaches us who is essential in our society, who is to be respected more in the future. These are good lessons for us to learn.
Can I ask you a very difficult question, because it's a very big issue? What form of economics do you advocate as we go forward in addressing not only COVID, but also the climate crisis?
I'm reading up a lot of good stuff about the Green New Deal of the European Community, for example, which is going to be relevant to the policies of individual countries like Ireland. It has in it a fund for just transition, which I think is extremely important. The fund for the workers, in our case, it's the peat workers, it's the bog, the Bordemona workers. But in other countries, it's coal workers, it's oil and gas workers, and coal in particular, in countries like Germany and Poland, for example, in a European context. And Spain has been good about a fund for just transition. These are the kind of policies that we're going to need. I do think that, the capitalist system that we have had has become rampant and irresponsible. That's the truth of it. It lost all connection with a more social contract. Unions have been weakened, less in this country, I'm happy to say, but certainly in the United States and in other countries. And therefore, the the recent, since the financial crisis, capitalism has become more unequal. We need to address that, and we need to do it in a way that also recognizes the need to be sustainable, to be resilient, and to have a fairer society. And the very fact that every country in the world is kind of blown sideways by the coronavirus is a good thing, because it teaches us our connections and our overall fragility. We are humans. Let's be clever about being human, and let's build back better, as the Secretary General is encouraging every country to do and every region to do, so that we will have a fairer future for our children and grandchildren. And they are looking to us to do just that.
So in terms of building back better, what has to happen in the next few months? As you know, COP26, which was supposed to be held in Glasgow, has been put back. But what are the key actions in the meantime that need to be done in the world?
I think there has to be a kind of phasing and sequencing, but a sequencing which integrates thinking about the climate crisis at the same time as dealing with the COVID crisis. So obviously, countries will need probably to have another stage of helping literally a wounded economy in this crisis as best it can, and then be planning at the same time for the more long-term steps that need to be taken. And those steps are kind of the way that the six steps that the Secretary General was talking about. It's all about how do we switch to much more green, clean energy. We need to insulate houses. That costs money. We need support for insulation of houses. That will give jobs. If we could, I mean, it takes probably about somewhere between, I don't know, 20, 25,000 to properly insulate a house. People don't have that money to do it. But if houses are insulated, that means jobs to do that, buildings, public buildings, transport being insulated. All of that is job creating. And I think we need to think about jobs like that at this moment in order to understand the way in which we integrate dealing with the climate crisis and dealing with the immediate, sharp indebtedness we're going to have and depression of the recession economically that we're going to have. But we can come out of this. That's not permanent. We can grow out of this. We grew out of a black hole recently, rather rapidly, and we need to do that, but we need to do it sustainably. It will be different.
I'm going to leave the last question to Roisin Byrne, and she asked, and I think it's directed at me as well as you, but anyway, how can we work with media to get these very important conversations out of silos?
Yeah, it is a good question. It's certainly a question as much for you, Kevin, but you have been doing your bit in the Irish Times and elsewhere, and I really appreciate that. But we do need, I mean, this is a time to have more and more conversations. I very much appreciate the Royal Irish Academy planning this conference. Now, it was planned to be a conference we were all going to attend, but it's almost more important now that we have this virtual conference when people are listening and are taking in conversations and are thinking. We're all now with more time to try to listen and think and really appreciate that we need to do that. So I think, you know, let me hear you on this as well, on how the media could do more. I mean, I like podcasts now. I like my podcast, Mothers of Invention. I'm glad it got quite popular. We're going to do another series very shortly. And the elders are doing podcasts. We haven't got them out in the public yet, but we are doing it. And we're very, very aware that you need more communications, more media communications, but it needs to be sustainable. I know newspapers and other media have a great problem about the advertising. We need to control the big guys that are taking all the advertising, and you know, the big tech companies. Somehow there needs to be a control of that in order that we can use our media for the common good in an appropriate way.
I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I think that would be a very good theme to embrace in a new conference. You know, it's dedicated totally to that issue because I think it's really important.
I do too.
Yeah. So if I could just say that throughout many of the questions that we've got from participants, and there are many, many more, Mary, they've been congratulating you on your address and expressing their great appreciation to you for the opportunity to listen to you. And if I could reinforce that as well, it has been a really broad-ranging address, and it's terrific that we got to so many different topics. And I think that the online element worked well. We had less technical problems than the Petersburg dialogue had this week, so that's a good thing.
Well, I thought they were very good questions, actually, and I think some of them, you know, as you say, warrant a lot more thought and attention, and some of them could be the source of, you know, further opportunities like this in themselves. Just the questions. They were very thoughtful. Yes, absolutely.
And I at this point, I would like to thank people for participating and submitting their questions. And just to confirm, this has been the plenary session of the Royal Irish Academy's conference on the global politics of climate emergency. A recording of this plenary session will be on the RIA website, ria.ie, over the next day or so you can tune in again through that channel. So thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Bye, Kevin.
Thanks, Mary.